Hello again. Alright, so Dr. Mashburn here, and we're continuing with female reproduction, and now we're going to move into the uterine cycle. So hopefully you have watched the video about the ovarian cycle, and so that was what was going on in the ovary with the development of the follicles and the oocyte. So now we're going to talk about what's actually going on in the uterus. And so what you're probably thinking, this is your period. So this is when people talk about having their period. We're going to talk about what all is going on in the uterus during the monthly cycle. So let me move forward. Okay, so this is called the menstrual cycle. So the uterine and menstrual cycle are the same thing. And these are cyclic changes in the endometrium, okay, in the response to changes in these ovarian hormone levels. So if you haven't had your if you haven't watched your female reproduction videos yet for the lab, when you look at the uterus, so it's kind of a upside down light bulb shaped organ with two tubes coming out either side, the fallopian or uterine tubes. And there's an opening. Let's kind of draw it like that. You know, I cannot draw. If you're in my class, they make fun of me. You have a thick muscle layer called the myometrium, and then the innermost layer of the uterus is called the endometrium. So when the sperm swim up, they're going to swim up near the endometrium. So the endometrium is an innermost layer of the uterus. So again, when you watch the lab videos, you'll understand that a little bit more. Maybe you've had endometriosis. The endometrium is what's the word I'm looking for? Not continuous with the uterine tubes. So there's endometrial tissue inside the uterus and all the way out into those fallopian or endometrial or uterine tubes. So endometriosis is really kind of an abnormal growth of that tissue. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we do, whoops, lost my microphone, when we do the labs. So anyway, so these are changes in the endometrium, and when we talk about the menstrual cycle, it has three phases. There's a menstrual phase, and this is the bleeding phase. Okay, so this is when you know you're on your period, and it lasts about 1 to 5 days. And then you have a 6 to 14 day phase called the pre-ovulatory or proliferative phase. Then you have ovulation, and then post-ovulation, so right here during this gap here between 14 and 15 would be ovulation. And then between days 15 and 28 you have the secretory phase. And this is a constant 14-day length, so it's very similar to the luteal phase in the ovarian cycle. All right, so if you're looking at the uterus, so we're looking at the endometrial lining, so inside the uterus, and we're going to talk about what's going on during these three phases. So again, a menstrual phase, a proliferative phase, and a secretory phase. So the menstrual phase, this is your menstrual flow. This is when you're actually shedding off the endometrial layer of the uterus. Okay, so if you look at the uterus, it has two layers. I'm going to blow this up in the next slide. You have a basal layer and a functional layer. So the basal layer stays there, but this functional layer grows and becomes thicker, and then is shed off each month, and it's growing and becoming thicker in anticipation of possibly there being fertilization and implantation of a baby. And so when we talk about pregnancy, we'll talk about where the embryo will implant. So the menstrual cycle means there's not been a pregnancy, so we're going to basically shed off the endometrial layer and then start to rebuild it. So then you have the proliferative phase, so it's going to proliferate. That means the endometrial layer is going to grow. So you can see it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger during this phase. All right. The last phase is called the secretory phase, and this is when you have these little endometrial glands, and they're nutritive glands. They will secrete this almost a sugary type substance that will kind of line the endometrium, and it provides the nutrition for the embryo before you have placenta, because the embryo is going to come down the fallopian tube or uterine tubes and come into the uterus and implant, and then it's going to take a while for you to get a placenta. So the secretory phase is going to allow there to be nutrition for a possible implanted embryo. So you're going to get more blood supply, so you see all these vessels, so enrichment of the blood supply, more glands are going to be formed, so more nutrients can kind of spread over the endometrium in preparation for a possible embryo to implant. Okay, so that's the secretory phase. You're secreting stuff. So this is what the inside of the uterus looks like. Again, you have a basal layer and a functional layer. And of course, we want to give it some fancy names. You have the stratum basalis and the stratum functionalis. So basal layer and functional layer is basically what that means, because stratum is layer. So let's draw our line. So this is your basal layer and this is your functional layer. So again, the basal layer stays there, it's constant. And so you have your uterine arteries and uterine veins, and so they're going to send out projections into that basal layer. And every month, these arteries and veins are going to proliferate. They're actually going to grow, and they're going to go out, and as the stratum functionalis starts to grow, as you lay down more endometrial tissue, these arteries and veins are going to grow. The base of the glands, if you want to use that word, is here, and they're going to continue. They're going to grow each month too as the endometrium proliferates. So here we have our things labeled. You have your epithelial layer. Remember that lines the tuber cavity. You have your capillaries, because arteries and veins have to be connected at some point. You have your uterine glands, those secretory glands. You have some venous sinusoids, and that'll become a little more apparent when we talk about the placenta and how the placenta and how the mom and the baby come together to form the placenta. We'll get there. But one cool thing about these arteries is they're called spiral arteries. And their particular anatomy, we've talked about before, you have these form follows function. These spiral arteries actually can kind of spasm and kink, and that's what happens at the beginning of your menstrual cycle. They kind of spasm and kink and basically shut down. And so if you quit taking blood to the endometrial layer, you're no longer giving it a blood supply. What do you think happens to it? What happens to tissue without blood supply? It dies. So that's kind of the first step. The tissue basically starts to die off, and then it will slough off during the period. Okay? So in the uterine cycle or menstrual cycle, the menstrual phase is day 1 through 5. So first day of your period is day 1. And your ovarian hormones are at their lowest levels. Okay? So estrogens and progesterones. But your gonadotropin, they're starting to rise. Okay? Because why do you need these hormones? What's important about luteinizing hormone in particular? The LH surge leads to ovulation. So we need these hormones to start to rise. So they're going to start going up in our bodies. The stratum functionalis, we're going to shed it off. We're going to have that menstrual flow or bleeding from about 3 to 5 days. Okay, so you start your period and you may see blood and tissue for about 3 to 5 days. By day 5, these ovarian follicles are starting to produce more estrogen. So while this is going on in the uterus, stuff's going on in the ovary as well. All right, so the proliferative phase is around day 6 through 14. So estrogen levels are rising because of the FSH and LH working on the ovary, right? And you're starting to cause a generation of a new stratum functionalis. You're going to start to get progesterone receptors in your endometrium. We'll talk about that a little bit later, what progesterone has to do with that. Your glands are going to enlarge, the spiral arteries are going to enlarge, so you're basically proliferating all of that tissue. Also, during the same time, that there's usually to block anything from entering into the uterine or into the uterus and through the cervix usually has a thick mucus plug. Well, as we're getting close to ovulation, all right, so as we're moving through the proliferative phase, ovulation is going to occur around day 14. Ovulation. And so we're going to start to thin out that mucus plug, all right, so that way sperm have a way to get through the cervix into the uterus and possibly to the uterine tubes and an egg. And so this is in response to rising estrogen levels. And again, at the end of this proliferation stage, you get ovulation. And then following ovulation, you have the secretory phase. So you ovulated the egg, all right, and so maybe the sperm is going to meet the egg, and so maybe there's going to be fertilization, so you want the uterus to be nice and thick and with plenty of blood supply and plenty of nutrition. This phase is called the secretory phase, and it's pretty constant. It's about 14 days. Doesn't change very much. And this is the endometrium preparing for the embryo. You're also going to see rising progesterone levels, okay? You're going to see the functional layer become secretory. You're going to see more nutrients being formed. And you're also going to see that uterine plug, that cervical plug reform, because the sperm had around between day 13 to 14, 15 to get in there. And now we're hoping that conception has occurred. And so now we're going to form that mucus plug so that no bacteria, no viruses, whatever can get in there and damage the uterus and the possible embryo. So that cervical plug is going to reform. All right, so if fertilization does not occur, remember we have to go back to that ovarian cycle. So if you don't have fertilization, the corpus luteum is going to degenerate toward the end of the secretory phase. We don't need it anymore. We don't need that progesterone because we don't need anything to keep the uterus quiet. Remember, that's what progesterone does. It keeps the uterus quiet so it doesn't contract, so you don't expel out the developing embryo. If there's no pregnancy, we don't want the myometrium of the uterus. We don't want it to be quiet. We want the uterus to become contractile so that we can shed off the internal layer of the uterus. All right, so your progesterone levels are going to fall. Your spiral arteries are going to kink and spasm and basically close off, which means there's no blood supply to the endometrial layer. The endometrial layer will die. Those glands will kind of shrink back to their into the basal layer. But the reason you get bleeding is those spiral arteries. They're going to spasm, and they're going to kind of relax and open wide. It's kind of it seems kind of weird. It's like they close down and then they open back up. And when they do that, you kind of get this gush of blood, and that rush of blood fragments weakens those capillary beds and causes the endometrium to flush off. So it's kind of, I don't know what. Sometimes I think about it. It's kind of like a hose, and the arteries act like a hose, and they're kind of washing out the inside of the uterus. I mean, that's probably not the best way to think about it, but that's kind of the way I kind of envision it. Sometimes I have crazy ways of thinking about things, but maybe it kind of helps you visualize how you can think about it when I tell you how I think about it. So we have to remember, as we're talking about these different cycles, what's going on with the hormones. All right, so you want to remember which hormones are moving, which ones are rising and falling. So this is the menstrual. Remember, this is the proliferative, and this is the secretory phase, right? So you've got kind of baseline estrogen and progesterones. As you go toward the end of the proliferative stage, your estrogens are going to start to rise, okay? Your progesterones are going to rise during the secretory phase, okay? Remember, why is it important to have those rising estrogen levels? The high estrogen levels are responsible for, remember that positive feedback? So go back to your ovarian cycle, that rising estrogen levels is positive feedback causing that LH surge. Okay, so yeah, we gotta tie in what we learned about the ovary to the uterus. All right, so just kind of review. We have our menstrual, proliferative, secretory. Just as a reminder, the menstrual and proliferatory are prior to ovulation. Okay, so this is going to be ovulation right here, and they kind of match up. All right, they correspond to the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. So menstrual phase and proliferative phase are going on at the same time as the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. The secretory phase is occurring at the same time as the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. So you need to be able to match these up. And I've got a picture that kind of does that for you. And it's also in your textbook, I believe, as well. So this is, your questions. You always have some kind of all that apply or possibly an essay question, and I'm going to say, during this particular phase, what all's going on. So, you don't learn it as what's going on in just the uterus or just the ovary or just in the hormonal hypothalamus pituitary gland. You got to think of this as a continuum. What is going on in the whole system? All right, so you've got to be matching what's going on in the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to what's changing in the blood, so hormone levels in the blood. How does that correspond to what's going on in the ovary? Not only how is the ovary, how's the follicle changing, but what's happening to the oocyte. When's it completing meiosis 1? When's it going to meiosis 2? Okay, when's it being ovulated? You've got to think about what the blood level amounts of progesterone and estrogen are. Okay, so and where are they coming from? not the hypothalamus or the pituitary, but from those cells around the follicle. Remember your granulosa cells and thecal cells? So yeah, you got to put all of this together. And how does that relate to what's going on in the uterus? So we'll just kind of look at this briefly. So during the menstrual phase, okay, again, you have low levels of estrogen and progesterone, and your follicles are starting to grow, and the ovocyte is starting to grow, it's starting to get bigger, it's preparing to be ovulated. Your hypothalamus is sending out GnRH and FSH and LH, okay, into the blood. That's targeting the ovary, which is causing those follicles to grow. Because those follicles are growing, they're producing the estrogen and the progesterone, so those levels are going to start to change, right? You're going to get that big spike in estrogen, which is going to lead to that LH surge, which is going to lead to ovulation. Well, if you draw your line down, we've finished our proliferative phase, and now we're in our secretory phase. We have our corpus luteum, and I told you it's kind of acting like a placenta. It's going to send out a bunch of progesterone, which is going to be the blue one. Lots and lots of progesterone being secreted so that we can keep the uterus quiet so it doesn't contract and expel a possible fertilized egg, so that embryo has a chance to make it. All right, so remember, this is a really nice slide, and what I tell students is to draw this blank. I mean, just take you a blank piece of paper, think, okay, what's going in the hypothalamus, what's going in the anterior pituitary, which hormones are they making, where are they going, what's their target, that would be the ovary. Well, what's going on in the ovary? The follicles are growing, the egg's growing. What's going to happen when the follicle grows? Is it making hormones? Yes, it's making estrogens and progesterones. What happens when you have too much estrogen, or when you get a big spike in estrogen? You get your LH surge. Well, that causes what? It causes ovulation. What's going on in the uterus? So this is pretty complicated, much more complicated than the male to me. So the female is more complicated. So don't think of this as just what's going on in the endocrine system with your hypothalamus and pituitary, not just the ovary and not just the uterus. You got to put it all together, because all of that together is what we call our period. Okay, that's just your cycle. That's your cyclical monthly time of the month in order to produce that oocyte and possibly lead to fertilization, which is going to take us into pregnancy pretty soon. Now, because we've been talking about ovulation, I wanted to kind of mention something about how to predict ovulation. Because if you're trying to get pregnant, or if you're trying not to get pregnant, it's a good idea to know when you're ovulating. Because when you're ovulating, that egg is good about 12 to 24 hours. It's viable. So you want to abstain or use birth control during the time that you're ovulating, so to prevent a pregnancy, or not use birth control so that you can hopefully get pregnant. So an average cycle is 28 days. Okay, but it can be shorter, it can be longer. Okay, so you may have a 23-day cycle, you may have a 35-day cycle, but you're probably ovulating if it's regular. Even if it's a 23-day cycle or a 35-day cycle, as long as it's every 23 days or 24 and every 35 or 36, you're probably ovulating. You just have either a short or long cycle. If you're going out, maybe past 35 days, maybe you feel like a 38, 40-day cycle, or it's very irregular, it's hard to predict, this is going to lead to infertility. You may have some issues. It's going to be really hard to predict when you're ovulating, because you may or may not be ovulating. It's very irregular. But as long as your cycle is regular, every so many days, you can have a good estimation of when your cycle, when you ovulate during your cycle. So, whoops, that should be good, not God. We'll fix that in the final copy. So what you have to remember is your luteal phase is always, and I never say always, I use, almost, I never say never. So almost always 14 days long. So if you're trying to figure out when you ovulate, over several months, you just make a note of when your first day of your cycle is. And you do that for several months, and you get an average. Okay, so my period typically is every 28 days. All right, well, 28 minus 14 days means that I would ovulate on day 14. So if I've done this January, February, March, April, May, and so I've done this for 5 months, and I've kind of figured out that my cycle is about 28 days, then I can subtract off 14 days from my cycle and know that I'm going to ovulate on about day 14. So in June, gives me a really good idea when I possibly can get pregnant. Now, what if you have a short or long cycle? Well, if you have a 23-day cycle, you simply subtract 14 from 23. That means you ovulate on day 9. So you have your period, count out 9 days forward. That's a good chance you may ovulate then. Okay? If you have a 35-day cycle, subtract 9. You're going to ovulate more than likely on day 21. So have your period, count out to 21 days. You may, most likely ovulate. So most people will tell you to do like a 4-day window. So if you're going to ovulate on day 14, then somewhere between day 12 and 16, those 4 days, those are good days to engage in sex and not use birth control and possibly conceive. Also, if you don't want to have a baby, those 4 days, use birth control, don't have sex, and avoid getting pregnant on those days. So this just gives you your most likely, most fertile period of your cycle. All right. So a lot of people ask me that, how do I know when I'm ovulating? So it's not tried and true. I mean, everybody's a little different. In some months you may have a longer cycle or a shorter cycle. You may be stressed out. It may be finals week. You may have been sick. So it's not foolproof, but it does give you a really good indicator of when you're most fertile. All right, so since we're talking about the menstrual cycle, just a couple of terminology that you may hear: amenorrhea and dysmenorrhea. So amenorrhea is lack of a period. Okay, so it's the absence of menstruation during your reproductive years. So we're not talking about being amenorrhea when you're a kid or in menopause. We're talking about not having a period when you should be. So between puberty and menopause. So during pregnancy, you don't have a period during pregnancy, so that would be amenorrhea. Primary amenorrhea happens during adolescence when you should be going through puberty, but maybe you're not. So maybe puberty is delayed. It could be a hormonal problem. A lot of girls who play sports are very athletic. They don't have a lot of body fat. Remember we talked about leptin? So sometimes that's a sign. If you're not starting your period, by 14, 15 years old, you need to get checked out. Possibly something going on there, something delayed, something abnormal. Maybe not, but go ahead and check. Secondary amenorrhea, this occurs in adulthood, and this is for some reason as you get older, not menopause, but you're not having your period. Maybe a hormonal imbalance, maybe you're hyperthyroid or hypothyroid, or maybe a lot of people that are hypothyroid have problems with their period. Could be stress. Stress does a lot to our bodies. Weight loss again. Women who have drastic weight loss, exercise all the time, excessive exercise, sometimes will stop having a period. This is common in college when girls are stressed and they're trying to stay thin and they're maybe playing intramural sports or they may be playing athletic sports, for a college team. All these can combine to cause you to stop having your period. And that's secondary amenorrhea. And if that happens, take a look at yourself and say, go to the doctor, get your blood test, get your hormones checked, and see. Because if it's something that needs to be treated, like taking thyroid medicine, you want to get on that. It may be that you need to eat a little more or exercise a little less. Dysmenorrhea is painful menstruation. So these are, what you might call the cramps. Some people have really painful periods, and some people, they're not bothered by it. But what that is, there are prostaglandins that are released by the endometrium that act as paracrines on the uterus and cause it to contract. So some people are just very susceptible to that. They have a lot of prostaglandin receptors, and maybe they make a lot of prostaglandins, and so they get really hard cramps. Because the cramps are there, the uterine contractions are there to help slough off and release the endometrial layer. But for some people it's very painful. And it can actually cause nausea and diarrhea in some people, and that's because of these prostaglandins. They can cause those secondary effects. So dysmenorrhea is a real problem. So if you have painful periods, you may need to, of course, take some pain medicines. But this is one of the reasons a lot of people will start taking the birth control pill to help regulate their periods, and sometimes that'll help with the dysmenorrhea as well. All right. So I think that's all I've got in this lecture. And I think this is a good place to stop. So probably the next thing we'll talk about is probably pregnancy. So I will see you in another video. Thanks a lot.